Jack came out onto the porch, tugging the tab on his zipper up under his chin, blinking into the bright air. In his left hand he was holding a battery-powered hedge clipper. He tugged a fresh handkerchief out of his back pocket with his right hand, wiped his lips with it, and tucked it away. He started down the path to the topiary. It wouldn't be a long job, he thought. A little touch-up would do it. The cold nights had surely stunted their growth. The concrete path ended as abruptly as a diving board. He stepped off it and walked past the drained pool to the gravel path, which wound through the hedge sculptures into the playground itself. He walked over to the rabbit and pushed the button on the handle of the clippers. It hummed into quiet life. It occurred to him that he didn't care much for these hedge animals. It had always seemed slightly perverted to him to clip and torture a plain old hedge into something that it wasn't. Along one of the highways in Vermont there had been a hedge billboard on a high slope overlooking the road, advertising some kind of ice cream. Making nature peddle ice cream, that was just wrong. It was grotesque. You weren't hired to philosophize, Torrance, he thought. He clipped along the rabbit's ears, brushing a small litter of sticks and twigs off onto the grass. The hedge clipper hummed in that low and rather disgusting metallic way that all battery-powered appliances seem to have. Jack touched up the rabbit's face and then zipped the clippers along its belly. That done, he shut the clippers off, walked down toward the playground, and then turned back abruptly to get it all at once. The entire rabbit. Yes, it looked alright. He would do the dog next.
If it was up to me, I'd cut the whole damn bunch of you down.
He would too, just cut them down and resod the lawn where they'd been and put in half a dozen small metal tables with gaily coloured umbrellas. He was going to start back, and then some impulse made him change his mind and he went down to the playground instead. He walked over to the slide, set the hedge clipper down, and after a glance back at the driveway to make sure Wendy and Danny hadn't returned, he climbed to the top and sat down. He could remember his old man taking him to the park in Berlin when he'd been Danny's age, and he'd done the whole bit, slides, swings, teeter-totters, everything. He and the old man would have a hot dog lunch and buy peanuts from the man in the car afterward. They would sit on the bench to eat them, and dusky clouds of pigeons would flock around their feet.
Don't you feed them, Jackie,
his dad would say. But they would both end up feeding and giggling at the way they ran after the nuts, the greedy way they ran after the nuts. Jack didn't think the old man had ever taken his brothers to the park. Jack had been his favourite, and even so Jack had taken his lumps when the old man was drunk, which was a lot of the time. But Jack had loved him for as long as he was able, long after the rest of the family could only hate and fear him. He pushed off with his hands and went to the bottom, but the trip was unsatisfying. He stood up, brushed at the seat of his pants, and looked at the hedge clipper. But instead of going back to it, he went to the swings, which were also a disappointment. The chains had built up rust since the close of the season, and they squealed like things in pain. Jack promised himself he would oil them in the spring. That was when he heard the sound behind him. He turned around quickly, frowning, embarrassed, wondering if someone had seen him fooling around. His eyes ticked off the slides, the opposing angles of the seesaws, the swings in which the wind sat. Beyond all that, to the gate and the low fence that divided the playground from the lawn and the topiary, the lions gathered protectively around the path. The rabbit bent over as if to crop grass, the buffalo ready to charge, the crouching dog. Beyond them, the putting green and the hotel itself. From here he could even see the raised lip of the rope court on the overlook's western side. Everything was just as it had been, so why had the flesh of his face and hands begun to creep, and why had the hair along the back of his neck begun to stand up, as if the flesh back there had suddenly tightened? He squinted up at the hotel again, but that was no answer. It simply stood there. You better get going, or they're going to come back and wonder if you were doing anything all the while, Jack thought. Sure, get going, because the snow was coming, and he had to get the damn hedges trimmed. It was part of the agreement. He began to walk back toward the hedge clipper at the foot of the big kid's slide, and the sound of his feet crunching on the crushed stone seemed abnormally loud.
Jesus, what is this?
He said softly. He stopped by the hedge clipper but made no move to pick it up. Yes, there was something different in the topiary, and it was so simple, so easy to see, that he just wasn't picking it up. Come on, he scolded himself. You just trimmed that fucking rabbit, so what's the...
That's it.
His breath stopped in his throat. The rabbit was down on all fours, cropping grass. Its belly was against the ground, but not 10 minutes ago it had been up on its hind legs. Of course it had been. He had trimmed its ears and its belly. His eyes darted to the dog. When he had come down the path it had been sitting up, as if begging for a sweet. Now it was crouched, head tilted. The clipped wedge of its mouth seemed to snarl silently, and the lions were closer to the path. The two on his right had subtly changed positions, had drawn closer together. When he had come past them, through the gate, that lion had been on the right, and he was quite sure its tail had been curled around it. They were no longer protecting the path, they were blocking it. Jack had put his hand suddenly over his eyes, and then took it away. The picture didn't change. A soft sigh escaped him. In his drinking days, he would have been afraid of something like this happening. But when you were a heavy drinker, you called it the DTs. What do you call it when you're cold sober? The question was meant to be rhetorical, but his mind answered it. You call it insanity. Staring at the hedge animals, he realised something had changed while he had his hands over his eyes. The dog had moved closer. No longer crouching, it seemed to be in a running posture, haunches flexed, one front leg forward, the other back. The hedge mouth yawned wider. The pruned stick looked sharp and vicious, and now he fancied he could see the faint eye indentations in the greenery as well, looking at him. Why do they have to be trimmed? He thought hysterically. They're perfect. Another soft sound. He involuntarily backed up a step when he looked at the lions. One of the two on the right seemed to have drawn slightly ahead of the other, its head lowered. One paw had stolen almost all the way to the low fence. Gravel rattled on the path. He jerked his head around to look at the dog, and it was halfway down the pathway, just behind the lions now, its mouth wide and yawning. Before it had only been a hedge clipped in the general shape of a dog, something that lost all definition when you got up close to it. But now Jack could see that it had been clipped to look like a German shepherd, and the shepherds could be mean. You could train shepherds to kill. The lion on the left had advanced all the way to the fence now. Its muzzle was touching the boards. It seemed to be grinning at him. Jack backed up another 2 steps. His head was thudding crazily, and he could feel the dry rasp of his breath in his throat. Now the buffalo had moved, circling to the right, behind and around the rabbit. The head was lowered, the green hedge horns pointing at him. The thing was, you couldn't watch all of them, not all at once. He began to make a whining sound, unaware in his locked concentration that he was making any sound at all. His eyes darted from one hedge creature to the next, trying to see them move. What kind of sound would there be if it got him? But of course he knew, a snapping, rending, breaking sound. He clapped, his hands over his eyes, clutching at his hair, his forehead, his throbbing temples. And he stood like that for a long time, dread building until he could stand it no longer, and he pulled his hands away with a cry. By the putting green the dog was sitting up, as if begging for a scrap. The buffalo was gazing with disinterest back towards the rope court, as it had been when Jack had come down with the clippers. The rabbit stood on its hind legs, freshly clipped belly exposed. The lions rooted into place, stood beside the path. He stood frozen for a long time, the harsh breath in his throat finally slowing. He reached for his cigarettes and shook 4 of them out onto the gravel. He stooped down and picked them up, never taking his eyes from the topiary, for fear the animals would begin to move again. He picked them up, stuffed 3 carelessly back into the pack, and lit the 4th. After 2 deep drags, he dropped it and crushed it out. He went to the hedge clipper and picked it up.
I'm very tired. I've been under a strain,
he said. He began to trudge back up to the hotel. Part of his mind tugged fretfully at him, tried to make him detour around the hedge animals, but he went directly up the gravel path, through them. A faint breeze rattled through them, that was all. He had imagined the whole thing. He had had a bad scare, but it was over now. In the overlooked kitchen he paused to take 2 Excedrin, and then went downstairs and looked at the papers until he heard the dim sound of the hotel truck rattling into the driveway. He went up to meet them. He felt all right. He saw no need to mention his hallucination. He'd had a bad scare, but it was over now.